Hi guys, so today's episode is all about neurodiversity and Capa. So we started off I think talking about the fact that it's a bit more in the news now. The fact that, there are more conversations happening around neurodiversity and that this is perhaps leading to a little bit more acceptance around it. We talked about what some of the sort of typical issues that often come up around neurodiversity are and how that might have an impact on family life and relationships within a family. One of the things that comes up a lot is the idea of a neurodivergent person living in a neurotypical world and how difficult that can be. So with that in mind, we spoke about thinking about, instead of trying to make neurodivergent people fit into the neurotypical world, whether it might be easier for us to make adjustments to the neurotypical world for neurodivergent people, if that makes sense. Alongside that, we talked about the importance of adapting strategies. We also talked about the fact that there is often a reason. There's a root cause for this behaviour. That's often some kind of difficulty in a child's life. So we looked at the fact that for a neurodivergent person, trying to fit into a neurotypical world, potentially that difficulty is sort of always present. So we recorded this one, I think it was just before Christmas 2023. But yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the next instalment of the Capa podcast with me. My name's Matt. I'm the senior practitioner at Capa First Response. I'm joined by Jane Griffiths and also Helen Bonnick. Hi guys, how you doing?
Hi there. I can't believe it's come around so quick.
I know, it always does, doesn't it? Right, so this week we're going to be talking about neurodiversity.
Something that's come up a huge amount this year. For families, yeah. I think particularly this year.
There's more talk about it, I think. There was much more awareness and sense that we understand this a bit better. I think we're really only starting to understand it in a useful way over the last year and a bit maybe.
And I think because we're doing our data from the end of the year data stuff.
Yeah.
And we're looking at the data that's coming in, which is, a bit dry thinking about the data, but so many more families are contacting us when there's a potential neurodiverse issue, whether it's diagnosed or not. So it's just very much more in the forefront.
Yeah. So, I suppose in my work, I've always known the crossover because there is a big crossover, isn't there?
Huge. I my head's going to, and I know we've probably all spoken about this before, but I certainly know Helen and I have, but back in 2009, when I first sort of was introduced into this field of work, there seemed to be much more emphasis on sort of adolescent behaviour. And it came from, it was relating to when there was already existing violence within a family.
Yeah.
And we fast forward 10 years, or actually a bit more than 10 years now. And so many more families are coming forward where actually that's less of an issue. And like you say, ADHD, autism, lots more sort of neurodiverse stuff is coming into families getting in touch with us because this is happening in their homes.
Oh, well, I was just thinking, I was just reflecting on my own experience. And I've been out of practice of direct work with families for some time now. So my sense of whether this is a big issue is from talking to people, listening to people, from what I've read. Certainly, we've got more research coming forward, and I'm thinking particularly about Nikki Rutter's work.
Yeah.
And I'm also conscious that then there's a lot of the reports that have come out. So it's in the news, isn't it? And there's a sense that more people coming forward for diagnosis, people in adulthood coming forward. So it's being talked about more. So I think there's a sense that it's a topic of conversation. We're hearing about this issue now, and that's great.
I mean, even on TikTok, I know my friend was talking to me about it. There's a massive, I don't know how you describe it really. I'm not really on TikTok. Well, I'm not on it at all. But
we're going to see you dance later, Matt.
luckily, we've all got our cameras off. Otherwise, you'd be seeing me busting my TikTok moves right now. But apparently, there's a lot of talk amongst young adults. I might be wrong here. I don't know, but I heard that there's a lot of people kind of thinking, right, and perhaps I do have ADHD, or perhaps I do have autism, and it's becoming much more of something that people are sort of looking at. And whereas before there would be a definite, no, I don't have that, it's nothing to do with me. Because the awareness around it is growing so much, people are much more perhaps accepting of themselves, thinking, oh, maybe I am neurodivergent. Maybe there is something there.
But I think I'm mindful of the cautiousness around that as well, in the fact that, if you or your child has a neurodiverse diagnosis or not, it doesn't necessarily mean they will use harmful and or aggressive behaviours in the home. So I think we need to probably think about, and I know that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today, but what's the difference between those young people and children that are using this behaviour and those that aren't, and separating that out a little bit.
So how do you think that neurodiversity sort of intersects with Capa, with this behaviour that we're talking about? And what kind of challenges might a neurodiverse person face in the context of a family structure? So why might this become an issue in a family?
I'm very conscious through all of this that I'm learning. You have much more knowledge and experience, the pair of you, than I do in this. So I'm very much learning from other people still all the time. But the sense that the typical markers, if you like, of neurodivergence to do with language and communication difficulties, different ways of thinking about things, sensory overload, all of those things, you can just see how they will connect with stress levels up to particular points in the day. And so it would be surprising if there wasn't a connection, an overlap. But as you say, for some families, perhaps because they've had more help early on, perhaps because they've got more support structures in place, perhaps because there's better stuff going on in their wider lives. Some families aren't finding that this is so much of an issue, or they're managing it more because they've had help maybe in knowing how to do that. Yeah.
I think coming back to a few of the things that you said there, so I think looking at why this might become an issue, I think you mentioned difficulties perhaps with communication, sensory overload. Did you mention anything else?
Probably.
Probably did. But you can look at those two straight away. Difficulty with communication, sensory overload. And you think, well, in a family environment, particularly when there's more than one child, there's often, in terms of sensory overload, there's often a lot of opportunity for that to happen in terms of other people making lots of noise. There might be lots of activity around. There might be, just things that are going to be difficult or potentially difficult.
And a lot of demands being made on a child, even in downtime, whether that's take your shoes off, take your feet off the sofa.
But we also talk about, I think a lot of the talking that we do with families is that, we're set up for a neurotypical world, aren't we?
Yep.
Everything around us is neurotypical. So suddenly, you've got a child who maybe thinks differently or has different needs, and we're asking them to adapt their needs to us.
Yeah.
And expecting them to manage in a neurotypical world and in a neurotypical school. And I think for me, it's looking with families a little bit more about what does that look like? What are the daily struggles? Like say communication being one of them.
A lot of us have real expectations about what family life should look like. And it's a really emotive subject. It matters so much. And those expectations can sometimes be quite limiting in terms of how you're going to expect your child to behave and how you're going to expect yourself to need to respond. And do you think that might be a problem?
There was a headline, wasn't there, the other week that I read about, was it on a parenting forum or something that I read about a woman who had taken her child to the shops and her child had a meltdown. And she had all what her perception was, lots of accusatory glances about keep that child quiet. Can you not control your child? What's going on with your child? And she just wanted to say, my child is different. My child has, a different way of looking at the world. Can you have some patience around that? So I certainly think as parents, we're probably more sensitive to wanting our child to act in what feels like a so societally appropriate way.
Yeah.
And that comes with a lot of pressure, doesn't it?
And I think it's that pressure, isn't it, that often leads to problems. So we have an expectation of, no, I guess it's a societal pressure that then the parent
that you
takes
put on yourself as well, don't you?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But recently working with a family, Matt, where, the parent was like, I cannot take my child round to my parents at Christmas because they don't tolerate the behaviour, that isolation it brings. And then what's the part you unpick in this behaviour? If we think about choices in behaviour and intent, that harmful, aggressive behaviour, at what point do we unpick that and think?
I think, can I go back over something you said there, Jane? Because I think even I can't go to my parents or I can't go to my in-laws.
Yeah.
That's not always even about, I know they're going to scream and shout and kick off, but it might be, now I'm coming at that from the wrong angle. It might be that your child needs to sit in a quiet corner with their headphones on and play on their gaming device the whole time. And that's the way they're going to get through 2 hours in a strange house with food they don't maybe...
But there might be pressure to be like, come on, you need to come and join the family. This is family time.
Granny or auntie is saying, take your headphones off. How, that's really rude sitting there like that.
Yeah.
That's when that's when the issue comes, isn't it? It's not...
And there could be an explosion in the behaviour of a child who's frustrated with that because they can't tolerate and can't do it. And then you can't get the child out of the house to even get to a grandparent's or an in-laws.
And this is where I kind of feel like it's that thing of expectation and the need to, because we do have such a clear idea about what family time should look like, about it's so strange even to me, because we often say, every family is unique, we're all different, but there's this, we still live by this ideal of what it will be. Are we going to spend the time together? We're going to sit down and eat together and, we're going to do this and, we're going to talk about certain things and that's all very neurotypical. And I'm not saying those things aren't lovely, and if those things feel right to you and your family, then 100%, go for it. That's good. But I think it's when we have an expectation of what should be happening, and then we that turns into a pressure that we put on ourselves and on our children.
And these times of year, especially, isn't it? Whether it's Christmas or other particular festivities, celebrations, parties of any sort, changes in routine, big things.
You said earlier on, Jane, I think it was you, that it doesn't, because a child has a diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you're going to see these behaviours.
No.
So it's about, if a person is neurodivergent, and we always talk about a neurodivergent person trying to fit into a neurotypical world. Yeah, it's the fact that they are struggling. That it means that they are going to struggle more, more or less dependent on the way that they are being supported in their, like we've spoken about in the home, in school, what their environment is like for them, whether it's an environment that makes life even more difficult for them or an environment that helps them to navigate the difficulties they're going to be facing already. So it doesn't mean that, having a diagnosis doesn't mean that of autism or ADHD, which is, probably the majority of the families that we talk to around this issue is the diagnosis they have. But it doesn't mean that you're going to see these difficult behaviours, but it does mean, as ever, normally when you see these behaviours, it's coming from a place of real difficulty for that child as well. And sometimes those difficulties are hidden because if the parents are neurotypical themselves, sometimes it doesn't even, it doesn't even register that something in their environment can be really, really difficult for that child, or really distressing. And because a neurotypical person might not notice it or might not see that as being distressing or difficult, it can go completely unnoticed. And that difficulty is always present, and that child and the discomfort is just building. And that's where a lot of this behaviour comes from, across the board. Where is the difficulty?
Well, we've made a lot of adjustments for people where we can visually see a disability or something that's impacting a person. We maybe make wheelchair ramps, or we put accessible bathrooms or lifts into schools to enable children to access things as freely as a child who maybe doesn't have something that's visible. But it's the invisible disabilities that we don't always make adjustments for. And that includes in our homes. Again, I come back to the fact that, we talk to parents quite a lot about, if you've got a child who is potentially neurodivergent, diagnosed or undiagnosed, struggling to get to school, maybe struggling to communicate with you in the first place about what the difficulties are at school. Asking a child to get to school, if you've got a child maybe without a diagnosis and a child with a diagnosis, the child with a diagnosis may have to do something 20 times just to get out of bed.
Yeah.
20 extra steps they may have to go through in their mind just to get out of bed versus a neurotypical child. So it's really understanding, what does your individual child need and what works for your child and what doesn't. I mean, we have lots of strategies we work with families, whether neurotypical or neurodiverse. And what we always say is it's giving those a go with your child and seeing how they cope and how they tolerate it and how they manage it. There's no point in me sitting down saying, well, you must do this with your child if their child can't tolerate it. How can they adapt the strategy that we give them to meet their child's needs if there's a neurodiverse issue? And that for me is the important thing, is how they adapt the materials or strategies or ideas that anybody may give them to meet their child's need, rather than expecting them to meet the need of something in a neurotypical way.
Yeah.
It's reminded me that some time ago there was a move to, as we were recognising that the high proportion of families coming forward with children with a diagnosis, a rewriting of a lot of the programmes to accommodate the needs of young children with a diagnosis. And then people started finding that actually all the youngsters, all the young people, all the families on the programme actually were benefiting from this. It wasn't just we're making adaptations for a few people, but everybody else has got to put up with it. The fact that the course, the programme, the sessions, the handouts, whatever, were made more neurodivergent friendly actually benefited everybody. And so there is work that has gone on from that side of things as well. We need to do a lot more work to understand what's going on in the families, understanding what the issues are, how we can help. But then the fact that people are starting to rewrite programs so the materials themselves are more accessible, more helpful, I think that's a real boost and something to be applauded.
Well, I know Annie Clements, who we work with from autism and ADHD, she talks very much, and this is where I hold this in mind a lot of the time that I'm working with families where there's a suspected diagnosis or not, is that we need to create neurodiverse environments, because it's easier for somebody who's neurotypical to adapt to that rather than the other way around.
Yep.
Our schools should be neurodiverse.
Absolutely.
Our home should be neurodiverse, and we're adapting to that rather than the other way around. And I think that's similar to what you're saying about the programs. And it's, more and more of that needs to happen. And that's how we certainly work with our families, thinking about, okay, one of the things I often will say to a parent if they talk about a child with a neurodiverse need is, are you left or right-handed? Now, if you're left-handed, you're living in a right-handed world. And it can be really tricky at times, which may seem nonsensical to somebody if you're not left-handed. But if you're right-handed, I'll say to a parent, do everything with your left hand today and tell me what that feels like. And I bet you've given up.
Scissors, isn't it? It's always scissors.
Or lots or something that's always really difficult. But it's true. It's setting up ourselves. Do something with your right hand if you're left-handed. Do something with your left hand if you're right-handed. How difficult is that? If you're left-handed, you already know how difficult it is. holding that in mind to be flexible and adapting to their need, I think is a really helpful starting point. Particularly like Matt said, you've got several other children in the home who maybe are not have a diagnosis or no suspicion, and potentially two parents or a parent that is no diagnosis or no suspicion. How hard it will be for your child to try to just catch up with what you're doing, and keep alongside you. And it's exhausting for both parties. That's why we talk about a lot of masking. I don't know if somebody wants to sort of broach on the masking issue that we hear a lot of talk about children masking at school, masking in situations.
Well, often that's that. I mean, I guess it's a bit of a crossover, isn't it, between what we were talking about last time in schooling, because that's something that we hear about a lot, is that a child will go to school in an environment where they don't feel perhaps as safe as when they're at home, and they have to mask. They feel though they have to present a version of themselves at school to basically, get through it. But that is a very draining thing to do. And so they can't keep it up. And so, they come home and they're exhausted, essentially. That they've depleted all of their resources to be able to continue with that. And then you see the meltdown.
And that's what parents talk to us about a lot, isn't it? They come home from school and there's just these huge tantrums or massive meltdowns from where a child, I talk about it like being like sprung like a spring.
Yeah.
And a child's just got to unspring after a day of suppressing what they feel and how they're coping or not coping.
Yeah.
The bottle of Coke
is
the
that's
other
what I was going to say.
often used, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fizzy bottle syndrome.
Yeah.
Yes,
it's about letting a little bit out.
An explosion.
Yeah.
And we often talk to parents about how we can open that fizzy bottle gently and let out that air gently, a little bit at a time. One of the things at Capa that we recognised is that more families are finding that their child potentially has a secondary diagnosis or a neurodiversity divergent issue. And what we've done there is, you becoming our specialist practitioner in this area to help us and families understand this more, because we've been doing this, certainly been around doing this work for a long time.
Yeah.
And there's certainly an element of, we know there's hundreds of thousands of adults walking around in the world as our children who do not use harmful and or aggressive behaviour in the home towards their parents. So for us, it's about understanding how we can support a parent whose child has a neurodiversity diagnosis or not, or suspected, and how we can support them to think about what's the behaviour they're using and why. Why is this behaviour being used? Is it because their developmental needs or their neurodiverse needs are so extreme that their behaviour is something that they have no control over? Or is it, can we unpick that a little bit and be actually, this is the bit that child can take responsibility for with this behaviour and we can support, and this is the bit we can't. And I think that's really important.
You're talking about dual diagnosis, and it's just reminded me that when, let's say 10 years ago, I used to think very much in terms of, when we were talking about the drivers of harmful and aggressive behaviour, I used to think very much in terms of a pie chart. And I think early on that was the thinking, that we would say, about 50% is because of this, and then the 30% because of that. And we were talking about perhaps experience of domestic abuse or violence in the home. We were talking about mental health problems, substance use particularly. And then coming to a realisation that this wasn't a pie chart, it was a Venn diagram, and that many of those children who have experienced violence in the home will also have a neurodivergent diagnosis. Children who've experienced trauma may well have a diagnosis, might not, but may also have it. So, often for some families it's layer upon layer, isn't it? It's not, well, this lot is this lot is that. We can send them off there.
Again, isn't it? It's
and why we need to understand the family in the round, isn't it? And the child as a whole person.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think it comes back as well to, obviously it matters, understanding where the behaviour might be coming from. But I think sometimes people get caught up in thinking about the diagnosis and, what is driving this. And it's, of course it's important. But I think in my way of working and my thinking, it's always, all right, but let's look at where the difficulty is to begin with. So this child is it to do with trauma? Is it to do with having ADHD? But they are really struggling, for example, with the levels of noise and chaos are at a certain point in the day. Regardless of where that is coming from, what part of their diagnosis, or the fact remains is that is something that they are really struggling with. So can we help them? As a child who is learning to, because as all children are, they are learning to regulate their emotions. They are developing those capabilities to be able to deal with difficulty, finding those coping mechanisms. So if your child is showing you, they don't have that coping mechanism yet, they haven't learned it, it's something they haven't developed, it's about saying, can we find a way to support you, to make it easier for you to navigate that difficulty? Because at the moment, what's happening is there is this difficulty and you're becoming overwhelmed and you're not able to cope with it. And we know you're not able to cope with it because you're using this behaviour.
I think the thing that's, again, comes back to is visible and invisible. And I think whilst parents, individual parents, may be aware of that, again, we go back to the society as a whole and think how much of that we just don't see and just assume. We now have things like, not all disabilities are visible, to enable, people to use maybe a disabled bathroom, who maybe doesn't have something visible. But again, it comes back to visible and invisible, doesn't it? We're asking, even if a parent within their home can help regulate a child or support a child, to enable things, any situation, whether it be noise reduction or, change happening, can manage that. As soon as they potentially leave the home, there's a whole myriad of things they have to negotiate and think about. Talking about a parent that had to go a certain way home, and if a certain car wasn't parked there, it could create a meltdown. We can't always control the stuff outside of our particular environment. So I think we've probably got a long way to go, haven't we? Mm-hmm. But how can we, I guess, maybe the first part is breaking it down and what's the bit we can help a child communicate with us around what they need and what maybe they don't need with a parent. And that's a big ask, because often children don't know and can't explain it and can't talk about it and can't communicate it. That for me is where the big ask is. It's tricky.